My friends, are you ready for a story of corruption? I told you back on my previous videos that we were going to have a wild tale of corruption when we talk about Malaysia, which you all guaranteed was going to happen when you went and spammed corruption in my Belt and Road video that I did. So for those of you who are watching right now, make sure to go ahead and like this video, and you better buckle up and prepare yourself, because today we're going to be telling the story of the One Malaysia Development Berhad, or the 1MDB scandal. We are talking about a scandal that has been described as one of the world's greatest financial scandals in history, and was declared by the United States Department of Justice as the, quote, largest kleptocracy case to date in 2016. That, of course, being before we did the whole video on the previous episode when we talked about the thing that happened in Vietnam. And I'm saying this right now. When we get into this, my friends, this story has everything. We're talking villains, friendship, intrigue, backstabbing, love, familial drama, extortion, so much more. Like, there are so many more things that I can't even begin to describe that sounds like some late night TV drama. So for anyone who has not seen my Belt and Road video that I've already done here, when we talk about the corruption that exists within Malaysia in the whole Belt and Road initiative, there was a 2015 document leak that showed that Malaysia's then Prime Minister, Najib Razak, had channeled over $700 million worth of cash into his personal bank accounts from 1MDB, which was a government-run strategic development company. The alleged mastermind of the scheme was a man by the name of Joe Lo, who was central in the movement of the 1MDB funds internationally through shell companies and offshore bank accounts in an effort to try and diffuse this money into hard-to-trace, what is the word? Sources? Locations? Just trying to put it in places that people couldn't really track. As of the year 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice found that Lo and other conspirators, including officials from Malaysia, from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, all of these varying peoples and different groups that were spread throughout the world, managed to divert more than $4.5 billion from 1MDB. Which, for anyone wondering, that is a lot of money. That is billion with a B. The money that we're talking about here was something that was used to purchase luxury items. It was used to purchase properties, including a super yacht, and finance the American film company Red Granite Pictures, as well as the production of The Wolf of Wall Street. Yes, you heard me right. The Wolf of Wall Street, that very famous story with Leonardo DiCaprio, the story about the insane financial fraud and corruption of Wall Street, was in turn funded by corruption. But how? Okay, how does something like this happen? And why is this story from the mid-2010s still going on to this very day? Well, get ready, folks, because we're going to be diving into it now. But first, we're going to need to provide a little bit of background. Hello, my friends, Takuya here, and before we get back to the show, I would like to thank today's sponsor, Factor. For those of you who are not familiar with Factor and their never-frozen meals, I have to say, this is something that definitely helped me back when my house was being worked on this previous January, because for essentially 3 months, we didn't have a kitchen. Which meant that Factor really did save our lives, because we got this box in the mail that had all these fresh, never frozen meals that could be warmed up in simply like 2 minutes, and that's it. It was super easy to do, and since we didn't have an actual kitchen, just a microwave, this was a life changer for us. Every single meal was customized for what it is that we wanted. There were keto options, there were vegetarian options, there were many, many different forms. And this is something that is perfect for each and every person who can craft exactly what it is that they want. So I'm telling you this right now, if you want to make things easier for yourself this spring, then go to factormeals.com/historyoferything50 and use code historyoferything50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box. It is just that easy, and I guarantee this is something that can help a lot of people. For anyone who does not recognize what I'm immediately talking about here, Malaysia is a Southeast Asian country, and on the south of Thailand lies the peninsular Malaysia. The Sabah and Sarawak territories are situated across the South China Sea and structure part of Borneo's island. For centuries, this region has been home to many different trade empires, and to this very day, ludicrous amounts of wealth still flows through the waters around Malaysia, and in particular around Singapore to their south. Islam would initially arrive in the region during the 8th century, and with time, numerous conversions would be made over the course of the 14th and 16th centuries, before the region was ultimately found by exploring Portuguese, who in 1511 would launch an expedition to take over this new region of Malacca. Now, I know that at this point we're going to be fast forwarding quite a lot, but all of this is still kind of relevant to the story that we're talking about here, as it's important to explain how Malaysia is a very multinational entity. This is something that was ultimately one of the major trade points in Asia, and from here it created a very cosmopolitan culture, something that combined different peoples from all across history, time, and places into a very unique culture. But moving on into the 18th century, the British East India Company exchanged with and controlled a part of India, Around then, they started searching for a base in Malaya, and in 1786, Penang was captured, and Georgetown would be established by the British under Francis Light. In the year 1800, they would take over the province of Stamford Raffles, and according to London's treaty in 1824, the Dutch and the British would split the state between them, and the Dutch would ultimately give up Malacca to the British. For anyone who has seen any of my Hearts of Iron 4 playthroughs on my gaming page, the British would largely control the region until World War II, when the Japanese, of course, would come and take things over here for a while. But after the war, the British would try to regain their control. However, leaders among the Malaysians rejected this and would request their own independence, which would initiate an uprising known as the Malayan Emergency. After only a few years, they were able to create the Federation of Malaya in 1948, while remaining under the protection of the British. But many people still at that time wanted complete independence. This would finally be achieved in 1957, but the area was about to undergo significantly more changes soon afterwards. In 1963, North Borneo, Sarawak, Singapore, and Malaya would all federate, and together they would form Malaysia. This is honestly something that at some point on my channel I'm probably going to have to tell the story of, but Singapore ended up being ousted from Malaya in 1965 due to political and racial issues, which is a fascinating story in and of itself, because it's one of the few times in history that a state was kicked out of another state, rather than, try to willingly break free. This, of course, would be followed by violent race riots in 1969. However, moving past this, by 1981, Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir Mohamad would go and help Malaysia's economy make history with insanely good growth. Within just a few decades, Malaysia would transform from a rural agricultural economy to a fairly modern industrial one, bringing all of the wealth that comes with it. And also, of course, since we're talking about wealth, corruption. In comparison to a lot of the geopolitical history that I go to here on this channel, this was definitely something that was more brief. But it is very important that I go and explain this, and I have to mention Mahathir Mohamad because he is a person who is going to be coming up in the story later. And so now, okay, scandal. What happens? Well, to begin with, our story today is going to involve a large number of characters, but the one who is at the heart of this is the ex-prime minister who we talked about in the Belt and Road video, Najib Razak. Now, Najib was elected to the Parliament of Malaysia in 1976 at the age of 23, then at the time replacing his deceased father in the Pahang-based seat of Pekan. He is the son of former Prime Minister Abdul Razak Hussein, so as you can kind of see already when we're talking about this whole thing in lineage, power kind of runs in the family. This is a thing that is somewhat common when talking about corruption cases. Anyway, in the early years of his political career, Najib would take on a deputy minister role in 1976. And between the years of 1982 and 1986, he was the Menteri Besar of Pahang, which is one of the regional leaders. And by leader, I mean leader of like one of the regions within Malaysia. Thereafter, until 2009, he was rotated throughout the cabinet of Malaysia, taking on various different ministerial portfolios in defense, in culture, in youth, education, sports, and finally, one of the most important ones, finance. Between the years of 1993 and 2009, Najib was a vice president of UMNO, this being the United Malays National Organization Party, which has maintained control of Malaysia's government with a parliamentary majority for more than 60 years at that point. Which you honestly feel the need to insert a little comment here at this point when I talk about absolute power corrupting absolutely, but yeah, you kind of see what ends up happening when you inevitably have a one-party state over the period of a large period of time. Anyway, before the big case that we get into here today, how about a initial corruption toe dipping, so to speak? One with a little bit of murder and assassination. This being with the Altantuya affair. Because there's always got to be more. Okay, so the Altantuya affair. Essentially, French courts would go and investigate allegations of corruption in the purchases of 2 Scorpini-class submarines, this being by the Malaysian Ministry of Defense in 2002, and this being at a time when Najib was the Minister of Defense. The allegations are that Abdul Razak Baginda, who was an aide of Najib, would receive, quote, commission payments from the French submarine builder DCNS. For anyone who is not catching what exactly that means, think about it in this kind of situation. You have multiple contractors that are trying to bid in order to be able to sell something to the government, and one of them perhaps is more expensive and maybe not as good as the others, but they manage to bribe the official that is choosing what gets the government contract. So even though the government is paying more, it still chooses it because on top of the several million that they're already paying, the guy who's choosing the whole thing gets a couple, maybe 100,000 as a bribe. I'm sorry, not a bribe, a commission fee. Anyway, the reason why this is called the Altantuya affair is that there is a woman whose name I am absolutely going to butcher here, but it is Charlie Bugelin Altantuya. My wife is laughing at me right now. Okay, this is a Mongolian woman. Okay, there's a lot of varying names with this. Gabby, you come over here and read this.
Shari Bugin, Altantuya.
Was that better, Gabby?
No.
This was a Mongolian woman who was hired as a French translator to facilitate the purchase of the submarine and was also, at the same time as being a translator, a mistress to Baginda, who in turn then tried to blackmail Baginda for a $500,000 cut and was then subsequently murdered. Because go figure. 2 policemen who were bodyguards posted to Najib were ultimately charged and found guilty for this, and when reviewing the Altantuya case, Tommy Thomas, who was the Attorney General of Malaysia from 2018 to 2020, would write that the evidence, quote, implicated not only Najib Razak as the person who gave one of the bodyguards the order to kill, but also his aide-de-camp, Musa Safri. So yeah, there are significant more possibilities here than just financial corruption, to say the least. Anyway, moving on from that, in the year 2004, Mahathir would go and retire, and he was replaced by his deputy, Abdullah Ahmad Badawi. Najib would become deputy prime minister and was after that given a very broad portfolio of different responsibilities, this being including the oversight of FELDA, the Human Rights Commission, and the Election Commission, to say the least. Najib would also go on to chair more than 28 different cabinet committees. And at the same time that he is doing all of that, he is also remaining as the Minister of Defense. This guy was, over the course of his career, accumulating a lot of power and influence. Fast forward a bit of time, and on the 8th of October 2008, Prime Minister Badawi would announce that he was going to step down in March of 2009, which in turn was going to pave the way for Najib to go and succeed him. Thus it was then on the 26th of March 2009 that Najib would win the UMNO presidency unopposed. He was then sworn in as Prime Minister of Malaysia on the 3rd of April 2009, and it is here that the 1MDB scandal would kind of start. So, okay, this is going to require a little bit of explanation in the first place, but 1MDB rather, this was not always called that. It had first started off as the, and I know I'm going to butcher the name when I say this, the Terengganu Investment Authority, or just TIA. This was something that was initiated by the Menteri Besar of Terengganu at the time, Ahmad Said, in 2008. Now, TIA was a sovereign wealth fund with an initial fund of $3.25 billion in 2008. And this is something that aimed to ensure the economic development of the Terengganu state. The fund's purpose was to ensure a long-term sustainable development while safeguarding the economic well-being of the Terengganu residents. This is something that, of course, makes sense. There have been many different sovereign wealth funds that have been used by a variety of different states in order to try and build up and develop their own kind of infrastructure, their own businesses, their own practices to create a sustainable economy for the future. But then, on the 31st of July, 2009, the Minister of Finance would incorporate and take over TIA, and from that, amend its name to the One Malaysia Development Berhad, or the 1MDB. This acquisition by the MOFI would take place 4 months after Najib Razak would become the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and in his announcement on the 22nd of July 2009, Najib would say that the decision to expand TIA into a federal entity was something that was made in order to enable its benefits to reach a broader spectrum of Malaysians rather than just the residents of one state. Which on the surface, if you're going and analyzing all that, it makes sense, and especially as a big political move to try and bring the country into the next century, it is something that I completely understand, and many people were very supportive in the beginning. The real secret, though, is that the biggest amount of developments that were going to be occurring, the biggest beneficiary of the plan, was going to be him and his bank account. But okay, before we get into all of that and talk more about Najib, we do have to go back a little bit in time to some other characters that are also very important to the story. Javier Justo and Tarek Obaid. Now, these are names that many people are probably not going to recognize from the very beginning, but it's important to kind of set this tone and understand how important they are to the story, as they are the crucial characters that help build this fraud in the first place. To describe these two guys as friends would be a complete understatement. The two men had met back in the 1990s when they would both party regularly in the nightclubs of Geneva, and by the year 2006, they were essentially inseparable. Justo had become an established businessman, running a large financial services firm called Finafor, and the owner of a Geneva night spot named the Platinum Club. He would regard Obaid as a kind of younger brother, and even in the year 2008, would lend him about $30,000 as well as a desk in Finafor offices in order to help start his own business, PetroSaudi. This is the business that is going to be crucial to the story, but at the beginning of this, it's not really all that much. Obaid did not have a lot of wealth necessarily to his name, but what he did have was a lot of connections. His brother, Nawaf, would serve as a special advisor to the Saudi ambassador to the UK, and PetroSaudi co-founder, Prince Turki bin Abdullah, would be the seventh son of the late King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, who would rule Saudi Arabia from 2005 until he would die in 2015. So those are both very powerful political connections and also at the same time powerful, wealthy connections. And these connections in the beginning were pretty much all that PetroSaudi had. When Justo left Geneva in 2009, PetroSaudi didn't really have anything. It was just a name that was a business card, and that's pretty much it. A little entity that was incorporated in London with an address at an anonymous business unit near Victoria. That's really the only thing that it had. And yet somehow, magically, this little business with nothing but connections would manage to rake in almost $2 billion 2 years later. How? The type of business that PetroSaudi utilized was access capitalism. This is a unique form of business in which one does not necessarily have revenue yourself, but rather you are capable of opening doors with the help of friends who in turn have high political or economic capital, so to speak. The basic idea was to capture a piece in the huge oil revenues that were being generated by state-owned firms in developing countries, which were veritable treasure chests that were waiting to be unlocked by a firm that would have connections and ties of the Saudi royal family, something that they could actually count on for full support from the kingdom's diplomatic corps. What PetroSaudi was doing was it was telling potential partners that it controlled oil fields in Central Asia, which it would put up as collateral in order to secure cash from state investors. And this, my friends, was the pitch that would land PetroSaudi's founders a meeting with the Malaysian Prime Minister in August of 2009. This all being aboard a mega yacht off the coast of Monaco, where Obaid and Prince Turki would spend the day with Najib, his advisor, a man by the name of Joe Lo, and other members of the Prime Minister's family. What resulted from this meeting was a decision for Lo and Obaid to work together on a deal that would allow them to both make stupid amounts of money. The interesting thing about this Lo figure is that although he held no formal position in the Malaysian government, he somehow had over time managed to become a very trusted confidant to the Prime Minister. And despite his youth, he had been instrumental in working with Goldman Sachs in order to be able to set up a sovereign wealth fund to invest the revenues of the oil-rich Malaysian state. Around the time that Lo and Najib would go boating with the PetroSaudi founders, the Malaysian central government would take control of the wealth fund, which in turn was soon renamed as the One Malaysia Development Berhad, or 1MDB. Thus, after, it was given a mandate to promote economic development within Malaysia. The fund would have more than $1 billion to spend, and Najib was the guy who had the sole power to approve investments and to hire and fire board members and managers. Lo, on the other hand, would appear to facilitate transactions, and he would even attend board meetings of 1MDB, acting as the kind of link with the Prime Minister. The details of the fund from the very beginning were major. The first deal that was going to be signed was only a few weeks after the meeting with PetroSaudi, and this was a whopping $2.5 billion joint venture agreement between PetroSaudi and 1MDB, this being inked during a visit by Najib to Saudi Arabia in September of 2009. Press releases that were given out at the time would say that the venture was going to, quote, make strategic investments in high-impact projects and underscore the confidence that Saudi Arabia has in Malaysia. But in reality, the truth of this was much darker. According to the U.S. Justice Department, the deal was merely a pretense for the fraudulent transfer of more than $1 billion from 1MDB to a Swiss bank account, something that was controlled by Lo, who is a mere 29-year-old with no actual affiliation within the Sovereign Wealth Fund or within PetroSaudi itself. And when we talk about a $1 billion deal, you would think that that is something that would take a lot of time. No, this was completed with extraordinary speed. Shortly after the yacht meeting on the 28th of August 2009, Obaid would introduce Lo to a guy by the name of Patrick Mahoney, this being the company director who would handle PetroSaudi's business affairs, and according to documents, Lo and Mahoney would meet for lunch in New York on the 9th of September. Less than 3 weeks later, the deal was done. PetroSaudi would contribute $1.5 billion in oil and gas assets to the joint venture, while 1MDB would inject $1 billion in cash. According to the court filing that the United States would make, 1MDB would transfer $300 million into an account that belonged to the PetroSaudi joint venture. But the remaining 700 million US dollars, this never went there. Instead, it was sent to a Swiss account at RBS Coutts, which was controlled by a Seychelles-registered shell company named Goodstar. The Justice Department would allege that Joe Low, and not PetroSaudi, was actually the beneficial owner and sole authorized signatory of Goodstar. U.S. authorities would also claim that officials at 1MDB would provide false information to banks about the ownership of Goodstar accounts in order to divert the $700 million. In documents on the 30th of September 2009, PetroSaudi would appear to direct the $700 million to be paid into an account that was controlled by the company. But somehow, magically, 3 days later, when the compliance department at RBS Coutts would request further details about the name of the beneficiary account, the address that was given by 1MDB was the Goodstar account. According to documents, the Goodstar transaction is something that would make Obaid, who was then aged 32, and Mahoney, who was aged 33, extremely rich men. Records would indicate that on the 30th of September 2009, Goodstar would agree to pay $85 million to Obaid, which the Seychelles company would describe as, quote, a fee for brokering services. Which I have to say, from the very beginning, that is a very, very large fee for just brokering services. The money was deposited into Obaid's Swiss JP Morgan account, and at the same time, emails and legal documents would indicate that Mahoney was given a contract as a, quote, investment manager for Goodstar. On the 20th of October, Obaid would email his contact at JP Morgan to request that $33 million be transferred to an account that belonged to Mahoney. 4 days later, Mahoney would begin discussions to set up an offshore company in order to buy an $8.4 million townhouse in Notting Hill, and by the 12th of November, contracts for the house had been exchanged. The former banker would create a numbered bank account in Switzerland, and all payments for the purchase were made from this account via a British Virgin Islands company that Mahoney had set up. As you can probably guess from right now, there is a lot of money that is moving very quickly and no one really knows where it's going. And that, my friends, is where Javier Justo comes back into play. Now, the reason that we bring up this individual back is that Javier was unaware of his friend Obaid's new success. He and his wife Laura were in Thailand in December of 2009 when Obaid would call Justo, offering him a director's position in London with PetroSaudi. He told Justo that the company had become an overnight success, but that he needed someone who was going to be able to help the company to grow. Now, initially, Justo would reject Obaid's offer, but eventually would come around due to some very promising deals. As an example, Obaid would promise him a salary of £400,000, along with millions in bonuses, along with the perk of a £10,000 per week flat in Mayfair, central London, which, as you can probably imagine, especially even back in the day, that's worth a lot more now. Justo was sold, and so he went to London in spring of 2010, and by June was a PetroSaudi director. This was awesome for him, but at the same time, he wasn't going to be getting into the more lucrative Asian market here with Malaysia. Instead, because he was a native Spanish speaker, he was instead tasked with launching a new operation in Venezuela, and would spend much of the course of 2011 flying back between England and Venezuela. Meanwhile, as all of this is going down, between September 2010 and May of 2011, 1MDB would agree to lend an additional $830 million to the joint venture with PetroSaudi, which would bring 1MDB's total investment to $1.83 billion. Of that new $830 million amount, it is estimated by the US officials that $330 million were actually just paid into the Swiss accounts that were controlled by Low. But we're going to be getting back to that here in a bit. Emails and bank records would suggest that in the 9 months from September of 2010, Obaid would manage to transfer $77 million from his Swiss JP Morgan account to his PetroSaudi co-founder, Prince Turki bin Abdullah. Then, banking records would show that in the spring of 2011, Prince Turki would also receive $24 million from the Goodstar account that was controlled by Low, and that within days, $20 million from these funds was transferred into an account that was belonging to, can you guess it? Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak. For anyone who's been paying attention to the amount of money that we've been talking about so far, it's quite a lot. And as all of this is going down, Low is becoming very well known in New York City, in particular the club scene, where he's become a person who tends to hang around the other super rich and was oftentimes seen by paparazzi hanging around with movie stars, R&B singers, etc. The amount of money that this guy is estimated to have thrown around is ludicrous, because according to US authorities, Low would spend about $100 million from the joint venture transaction on properties in Hollywood and $40 million on New York apartments. That's $140 million in just simple real estate for himself. In addition to those kinds of properties, the funding for the Wolf of Wall Street movie? Yeah, that is something that the US Justice Department would allege could be traced directly back to the diverted PetroSaudi joint venture. And I'm going to need to explain that here for a second because this is a bit wild. If you're not familiar with the Wolf of Wall Street, the company that was behind this is called Red Granite Pictures. And this was a Los Angeles-based filmmaking outfit that was responsible for the Martin Scorsese-directed Wolf of Wall Street, along with Scott Cooper's Out of the Furnace and Alexandra's Aja's Horns. This was a company that was founded by Riza Aziz, who is actually the stepson of, can you guess it, former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak. Aziz would found Red Granite back in 2010 and would ultimately face 5 charges of laundering around $250 million out of the 1MDB fund. Low would actually be thanked personally in the credits of Wolf of Wall Street. That is a wild world. In July of 2016, though I know that we are skipping ahead here a little bit of time, the Department of Justice would file the largest forfeiture complaint in US history, citing $1 billion of assets alleged to have been funded by the 1MDB theft. Assets seized included Aziz's mansion in Beverly Hills, the Park Laurel condominium in New York, Low's Hollywood Hills mansion, and the Time Warner Center apartment in Manhattan, as well as all future profits from the Wolf of Wall Street. The film ultimately went and made $392 million on release back in 2013, and it would pick up 5 Oscar nominations, including one for Best Actor for its lead, Leonardo DiCaprio. Even though I know that we're going to be going in and talking about the other parts of the scandal, the actor, Leonardo, he ended up finding himself also embroiled in a little bit of the scandal because it was revealed that Low had given him a lot of gifts, including a Picasso painting that he had bought for $3.28 million, as well as a Basquiat collage for $9 million. That's over $12 million in art that was just given as a gift. Ultimately, these items would be voluntarily surrendered by DiCaprio when the government would come and request it. But I digress. That's the whole thing with the Wolf of Wall Street. We're skipping ahead a little bit at a time. It hasn't quite come to that yet. If we go back in time, in the meantime, as all of this is going down in 2011 and 2012, Justo very quickly starts to grow annoyed with his working conditions at PetroSaudi. And there's a key reason for that. According to his wife, the first issue was that he discovered his salary was only about half of what Obaid was supposed to have offered him. This is something that was only made worse when he learned that the multi-million-dollar bonuses that he was supposed to be receiving were actually significantly smaller than that. Instead of 7 figures, they were more like 6 figures. Which, don't get me wrong, is actually still an immense amount. Of course, that's great. But on top of that, he would also go on to claim that the payments that he was supposed to receive came in late and sometimes not at all. And also that the flat that he was supposed to be given for free, the £10,000 per week flat, mind you, many times that was just never actually paid for. And so he had to pay for it himself when it was, supposed to be done by his employers. At first, as all of this is happening, Justo thinks that these are just accidents, that nothing was inherently malicious or anything like that. Things down to poor accounting, that sort of thing. But as time went on, he apparently becomes more and more worried because Obaid's behavior, his friend's behavior, has started to change. Justo would say that Obaid, with time, would become more and more arrogant after striking it rich. He was especially disturbed by what he described as changes in his young Saudi friend, saying to other people that Obaid had become irrational and would oftentimes display uncontrollable rage. Theirs was a friendship that had lasted for many, many years, and yet over the course of just about 12 months, this is something that would actually snap. At the end of 2010, Justo would miss a flight for an important meeting, and even though he would apologize to Obaid, his friend would apparently go mad, sending him a vicious stream of abuse via text messages and emails. Not knowing what was going on, and apparently sick with worry, Justo would resign in March of 2011. At that point, he just couldn't take it anymore. And in angry email exchanges that would follow, Obaid would insult Justo, calling him arrogant and a smartass, among other things. Not exactly a way that you want to keep around an employee or anything like that, or much less a friend, but that's how it all went down. Ultimately, Justo was going to leave, and so he would go and meet with Mahoney, who in turn would help him to hammer out the terms of his departure. What I'm saying right now is something that is not definitively proven. This is something that comes directly from Justo himself and his writings on the matter. Per Justo, Mahoney had agreed to pay him about 6.5 million Swiss francs, or around 5 million pounds, or if you want to equate that, around $7 million or so in a severance package. However, in the midst of a very heated conversation, Mahoney would receive a phone call from Obaid, who apparently told Mahoney that he wasn't going to give him that. Instead, just do 5 million Swiss francs, or 3.85 million pounds, or around $5 million or so. The next day after that, Justo would then go on to claim that he was told again his amount would change and that his severance package was only going to be 4 million Swiss francs. Again, still a large amount of money, but in comparison to what he felt that he was rightfully owed, it didn't even come close. And so as Justo grew angrier and angrier, what he decided to do was to take a copy of the data on the PetroSaudi servers. At this point, this is when people would probably think that a whistleblowing leak would happen and more would come out, but no, nothing does actually happen immediately. Time would pass, and in September of 2013, a little more than 2 years after he had left the company, Justo would go and send an email to Mahoney, insisting that he needed to be paid what was rightfully owed to him, and warning that if he was not paid this, he had a file of information on PetroSaudi. Of course, Mahoney was furious, and in the exchanges that would follow, he would accuse Justo of blackmail, which, yes, it technically was blackmail. He was trying to lord over information in exchange for money that he had on the company, and this is where we start to enter spy movie territory. You see, my friends, a few months later, there would be a journalist by the name of Claire Rucastle Brown, someone who would meet a contact who showed her a screen grab of internal documents from PetroSaudi. This being on a single printed page in which there were highlights of PetroSaudi's dealings with 1MDB with the heading, quote, thousands of documents related to the deal. Elements of this data leak were out, and this was going to be potentially a massive story. I don't want to set the stage up here like I'm trying to build some kind of big dramatic event, but honestly going into this, if any person knew that this was going to be a big story, she's probably a prime example of this. Rucastle Brown was actually born on the island of Borneo, in what is today now actually a part of Malaysia, though this was still when it was part of the British Empire. Her father was actually one of the colonial policemen and was also the head of the local intelligence service. For years, she went and had worked with the BBC, and then in 2010, she set up something called the Sarawak Report, this being a website that was dedicated to uncovering corruption in the place that she had been born. If I was going to be doing an entire video on just the history of corruption in Malaysia, which I know when we're talking about this whole thing with the 1MDB, this is taking up like 90% of this entire thing because of just how big of a scandal this is. But the sheer amount of things that have gone on within the state are a lot, to say the least. And working out of just a simple apartment in London, she would go and publish story after story, exposing corruption within the timber industry, within the oil industry, all of these varying different companies that were going and destroying the rainforest and the ecosystems of the country, all in the search for profit. Her email during this time period that she was working as a whistleblowing journalist was hacked. And when this would happen, she would receive death threats, but still would continue to fight back regardless. This got so bad for her that early on in 2013, Malaysian politicians would even go and label her a, quote, enemy of the state. That is how big and important this individual was, and oh boy, was she about to make a very strong case for that title. After she went and met with her contact, Rucastle knew that she needed to get the 1MDB documents. The first issue that she was going to have, though, was the source of the PetroSaudi papers. This being because this source apparently wanted millions of dollars for the information, and that was money that she simply did not have. The other issue that has to be pointed out is that even if if she got the information, there was likely no journalist in Malaysia that wanted to touch the story at all. In Malaysia, Najib had just won a tightly contested election, and he had accumulated a lot of power at this point. Rumors were already swirling around the PetroSaudi documents, with some people speculating that the entire thing might not be real. It might just be an elaborate trap that was set up by the Prime Minister to try and trap his critics into criticizing him so that he could then sue them for libel or throw them in prison. But still, despite the risk, Rucastle would go and arrange with her contact to meet the source in Thailand. And in October of 2014, she would finally come face to face with Justo. It was at this meeting that Justo would tell Rucastle that he wanted $2 million in exchange for the PetroSaudi 1MDB documents. It was, as he said, the money that he should have been paid when he left PetroSaudi. Now this, my friends, is a lot of money to ask for, and although he would share a few of the documents in the meeting, he wasn't going to be giving up all of it. He was adamant about the situation. If he was not paid this money, he was not going to be giving up the data. The problem is that Rucastle didn't have the money to pay for it, as I have already said. Instead, what she was going to need to do was to find a wealthy person who was willing to pay for it, which, as time went on, was becoming increasingly likely, to be fair. Around this time, concerns about 1MDB had begun to spread in Malaysia and in economic circles. Financial analysts in the country that were not afraid of the president would point out that the fund just was not actually generating enough money in order to even cover the interest payments on the billions of dollars of debt that it had already acquired. Like, of all this money that had been put into the fund, of all of these things that had been invested in, they weren't making enough money to actually pay even the interest on the debt that they had accrued. Because, hey, go figure, when we're talking about this, considering the hundreds of millions of dollars from everything that we've already talked about that have been spent on artwork, on jewelry, real estate, gambling, parties, which, mind you, was a lot, these things don't necessarily qualify in most financial circles as being a investment. This would get so bad before there was ever really any proof of wrongdoing that by 2014, Najib's political opponents would take to taunting him with the accusation that the wealth fund was not a wealth fund. It was not the 1MDB. It was the One Malaysia debt of billions. Which at that point it was. It was literally a debt of billions. By August of 2014, Najib's political situation was getting worse. Mahathir Mohamad, who was the massive figure of modern Malaysian politics that we spoke about before when talking about the history of Malaysia, he is the person who had served as prime minister from 1981 to 2003 and had been a massive ally of Najib. He announced that he was withdrawing his support from Najib, who was, mind you, his former protege. In the weeks that would follow this event, Mahathir would become even more vocal in his criticism, warning that the 1MDB was adding unsustainable amounts of debt to what was already a very dangerous amount of debt for Malaysia. This wasn't really going to matter, though. The government would do nothing. There was no proof of any wrongdoing, at least not yet, and so with time as this would pass, the debt of the fund would only grow. To put this into perspective, so people understand the amount of money that we're talking about here, by November of 2014, 1MDB owed almost $11 billion. And Najib, who chaired the fund's advisory board, just didn't really care, telling state news agencies that the government was not liable for the debt if the fund ever just went bankrupt. Which is a very bad thing to say, mind you, especially when you are trying to get bonds and funding and cash from the country itself. As the crisis was growing worse within the Malaysian state, Rucastle still needed to find a person who was willing to pay Justo for the PetroSaudi documents. The person that she would end up reaching out to ultimately was a man by the name of Tong Kui Ong, who was the owner of The Edge. This was a Malaysian business weekly that actually was one of the few entities that was talking about 1MDB and openly criticizing it and the government. If she could convince Tong to support her, then this perhaps was the opportunity that she needed. So it was then, in January of 2015, that Tong, Rucastle, and Justo would all meet in a Singapore hotel conference room. And it was at this meeting that Justo would explain that hundreds of millions of dollars that were intended for economic development in Malaysia had instead been diverted into a Seychelles-based company. The man at the center of all of this was Najib's advisor and family friend, Jo Lo. In exchange for the information, Tong would agree to pay Justo the $2 million. And immediately after doing so, they were handed the disk drives with the data. Funnily enough, when I say that, or I say they do so, I don't actually mean that they handed over the money. No, when they agreed to hand over the money, they were just given the data. Weirdly enough, the payment wasn't actually made here at the time. Justo did not want the money in cash, and he was worried that a large transfer of funds into his account would be something that would look suspicious. But either way, the data has now finally been given, and the press finally has the documents. This is where everything then goes down. 1 month later, on the 28th of February 2015, Rucastle would post the first big story online under a headline titled Heist of the Century. The article would claim to show how $700 million had disappeared from the 1MDB joint venture and had found its way into varying different offshore companies and Swiss bank accounts. The impact of this article was immediate and massive. In the United States, law enforcement officials who had been alerted to reports that Lowe was spending huge amounts on New York apartments now had a fix on the possible source of where he was getting his money from. This was like a whole Al Capone situation and tax evasion all over again. The Sunday Times paper would run an interview with Mahathir, the former Malaysian prime minister, who would call for an immediate investigation as well as a full audit, saying, and I quote, "Somebody must be doing something stupid to part with $700 million for no good reason as far as I can see." Everything was coming to light. The jig was up, and naturally, Najib and his allies would be forced to respond. The outcry from the public was simply too great. So it was then on the 1st of March 2015, the day after the article would go live, that 1MDB's management would claim that it had exited the joint venture back in 2012, and that somehow it had already received back its investment in full with an additional profit of $488 million. PetroSaudi would go on to claim that the $700 million had all gone into, quote, PetroSaudi-owned entities, denying, in other words, that companies controlled by Joe Low had ever received payments in the deal. So what the managers of the wealth fund were claiming is that despite their growing massive debt, that somehow the initial investment that had been put into it had actually already turned a profit, and that just wasn't reflected there because of the debt and investment of other entities and things. It's not a good defense, mind you, and no one is really believing it. Meanwhile, as all this is happening, 1MDB's bonds had effectively been downgraded to junk. No one in their right mind was going to buy bonds for a government scam that was just going to launder and steal their money. In fact, it was only after another $200-odd million of Malaysian government funds were required to plug a hole in 1MDB's finances that Najib would finally order investigations by the country's Auditor General and the Parliamentary Accounts Committee. He didn't want it to happen, but he had to at that point. Soon, the country's central bank as well as the anti-corruption agency were also looking at the 1MDB. And the police, in turn, were starting to look at Najib. And he was not going to take this well. We're not going to be getting into absolutely everything, of course, but over the period of 2015 and beyond, Najib would tighten his grip on power. Because he was both the prime minister and also the finance minister, this meant that he naturally wielded enormous amounts of authority. In April of that year, the government would push through harsh penalties and restrictions on free speech, particularly for social media. 5 executives of Tong's The Edge Media Group, the company that had gone and published details of the PetroSaudi deal, they were arrested for sedition. The government would also go and introduce a new law, something that on paper was supposed to be targeting terrorists, but would allow suspects to be detained indefinitely. You can imagine what that is being used on. In July of 2015, The Edge, that had started this whole thing in Malaysia, was banned from publishing. Literally anyone with glasses, or even without, a blind bat in the scenario could see that the government was trying to crack down on potential whistleblowers and hush all of this up. And despite the heavy-handedness, the crazy part about all of this is that at that point, Najib personally had not actually been caught with anything red-handed, at least not yet. But then, on the 2nd of July, 2015, Rucastle and the Wall Street Journal would report that the Malaysian government investigators had discovered that $681 million from banks, agencies, and companies, all with ties to 1MDB, had been deposited in Najib's private accounts back in 2013. And oh, this was massive. A few days later, investigators would officially raid the offices of 1MDB. Najib was at this point firmly in the spotlight. He was now at the center of a corruption probe relating to allegations that billions of dollars had disappeared from the Malaysian investment fund that he personally controlled. As politicians and government agencies turned against him, it seemed that Najib was cornered, that there was no way he could escape. but he was not going to go down without a fight. On the morning of Monday, the 28th of July, the Attorney General Abdul Ghani Patel, who, mind you, for years had been a party loyalist who had previously gone after the Prime Minister's opponents, would arrive at his office expecting to finalize corruption charges against Najib. But the Attorney General never was able to press those charges, because upon reaching his office, he was instead dismissed by a civil servant. In a public statement that was given, Najib would say that the country's top legal official was simply too ill to continue in his role, something that was, never actually given a choice on. Also relieved of their posts were the heads of the special branch and the deputy prime minister, and at the same time that this happens, 4 members of the investigating parliamentary accounts committee get promoted, which doesn't sound like a very bad or weird thing here in the first place, but the problem is that when they are promoted from this parliamentary accounts committee to cabinet positions, that means that they're no longer doing any investigating because they're not part of the committee. And so with no one left to continue the investigation, no one with the power to do so, the committee's work was officially declared suspended. Which is bad, right? Okay, but it's only something that's suspended. It's not like there's anything that would potentially put any kind of investigation on a permanent hold, and then, oh no, wait, the very next day, a mysterious fire ends up sweeping through police headquarters where records of white-collar crimes are kept, like fraud and embezzlement. How tragic. I totally didn't see that coming. For all intents and purposes, it seems that Najib was back in control. However, at the same time that is happening, there is a loose end that very well could overturn everything. Remember Javier Justo? Not only had Justo leaked information about 1MDB's dealings with PetroSaudi, he was also a potential witness in any future court proceedings about financial scandals within the country. He would have to be taken care of. So it was then that on the 22nd of June, 2015, when he was expecting a visit from tourism authorities in Thailand to sign off on paperwork for a business enterprise, that instead of tourism folks showing up, a squad of armed Thai police officers would burst in through the door of his home, tackling and arresting him. The police would quickly move into his office, ripping out any computers and emptying the filing cabinets of all data and resources. Justo was being set up. After 2 days in a ramshackle local jail, he was flown to Bangkok and paraded before the media, where he was charged with an attempt to blackmail his former employer, PetroSaudi. Which, to be fair, among all things that he was doing, he wasn't just releasing documents, he did actively try to blackmail them. Even if it was to get the money that he was rightfully owed, as he felt, he literally was blackmailing them. Anyway, Javier initially refused a deal to confess, but later felt that it was really his only option after spending several days in extremely traumatic conditions in a Thai prison. He was forced to admit that PetroSaudi and 1MDB's deals were legitimate, forced to incriminate himself, and forced to say that he was politically motivated. Even after this deal, in which he was promised to be released, he was still sentenced to 3 years in prison, a truly hellish experience in a Thai environment. As he would say about the matter later, quote, "In a Thai prison, you sleep on the ground like a dog. It's overcrowded. 50 people in a 40 square meter space. It's 45 degrees Celsius. 50 people are using a single basket of water, and the conditions are unimaginable. I wanted to die after a week." That being said, he would go on to spend 547 days in that jail cell. It's at this point, my friends, that we are going to start moving forward in rapid succession as developments occur. As all of this is happening in January of 2016, the new Attorney General in Malaysia that takes over ends up clearing Najib of any wrongdoing in a press conference, saying that the $681 million that he received was a donation from the prince in Saudi Arabia, and $620 million were returned. However, at a press conference, Apandi would end up actually contradicting himself by presenting 2 flowcharts, which were supposed to show Saudi donations, but they actually ended up showing that funds originated from Malaysian sources, not Saudi sources. That same month, Medium, which is a popular article platform, would get taken down in Malaysia, this being over a single article that was posted by Sarawak Report. Which, if you remember from the beginning when we talked about Sarawak Report, this being the London-based site that investigates government wrongdoings in the East Malaysian state of Sarawak, over the years, this was a source of massive amounts of investigative journalism in the country, and it is something that looked at the construction industry, the media, and the alleged corruption of Malaysia's Prime Minister Najib Razak. The previous summer, at the height of the scandal, the Malaysian government had blocked the Sarawak Report website. After the block, Sarawak Report began posting some of their stories to Medium, meaning that Malaysians could still go and see what their government was allegedly up to. Following the official investigation's conclusion, officials from the Malaysian Communication and Multimedia Commission, or MCMC, would issue a takedown notice to the publishing platform over this single article. Medium would respond to the controversy, asking for the MCMC's evidence that Malaysian law had actually been broken, and also a copy of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission's statement that the allegations were untrue. The crazy part is that rather than sending a response, Malaysian officials just simply blocked the site. This was a truly insane step. Because despite censoring smaller sites in the past, the blocking of Medium in its entirety, that is a massive leap in censorship. Mind you, even China, which is notorious for tight control over what its citizens sees, at this point in its history, it wasn't blocking Medium. And as the central government cracked down, elements within it and also from the provinces would start to break away. Former Kedah Menteri Besar Mukriz Madahir would resign his office on the 3rd of February 2016, saying that he did so because he had been told by Najib Razak that he was in the wrong by criticizing him and the 1MDB publicly. Next, opposition member of parliament Rafizi Ramli was arrested and charged under the Official Secrets Act by the police and the government for leaking information about the Auditor General's report on the 1MDB scandal. In June, Mukriz, the individual that we spoke about here before, he would get expelled from the UMNO, and his father, Mahathir Mohamad, the guy who had been Malaysia's 4th prime minister and who had been a Najib supporter from the very beginning since Najib had assumed office, would withdraw his support and quit UMNO later that same month. Fast forward to July 21st, and the United States Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, would announce the filing of civil forfeiture complaints seeking the forfeiture and recovery of more than $1 billion in assets associated with an alleged international conspiracy to launder funds misappropriated from 1MDB. The suit would say that $681 million found its way into the personal account of, quote, Malaysian official 1, which would later be identified as Najib by both the US and a Malaysian minister. And that amount of around $1 billion would grow. By June of 2017, the amount that was estimated to have been siphoned away was upgraded to a whopping $4.5 billion. At this point, Joe Low, a guy who we've not actually really mentioned here in a while, he would become wanted by Interpol, and at that point had been wanted for at least the previous year. No one, though, was able to actually find him. He had simply disappeared with all of his money. It wasn't like he had totally disappeared, though. He was trying to get his name cleared, even if publicly he would not ever come forth. March 1st of the very next year in 2018, the Wall Street Journal ends up publishing an article based upon numerous emails which went between Elliot Broidy, his wife Robin Rosenwig, and Joe Low, in which Joe Low was apparently trying to pay Broidy $75 million if Broidy could get the United States Justice Department to drop its investigations into 1MDB. And yeah, I'm saying this right now. If anyone who is watching this right now has not heard of Elliot Broidy, this is the guy who from 2005 to 2008 would serve as the finance chairman of the Republican National Committee, the RNC. In 2009, he was convicted in a public corruption and bribery case in New York, and that's not the best start, and that is something that would only continue. In October of 2020, Broidy would plead guilty to acting as an unregistered foreign agent working for Chinese and Malaysian interests. He sought to lobby the highest levels of US government to deport a dissident of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, that was living in the United States, and he also tried to arrange meetings for a PRC minister with the Attorney General, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and other high-level officials during the PRC's minister's visit to the United States, all while concealing the lobbying money that he was supposed to be receiving. Yeah, not the best individual that if you're trying to, get your name cleared, that you want this guy on your side. And anyway, this is where everything changes. Because you see, my friends, in May of 2018, Najib is actually defeated in Malaysia's general election. This being amidst deepening anger over 1MDB, rising cost of living, just a lot of issues that the country is facing. His party has lost an immense amount of power. So much so that the UMNO party finds itself out of power for the first time since independence. This is the party that, mind you, in Malaysia, it has almost been a one-party state. This has been the entity that has controlled everything. As soon as the new government is in power, 2 days later, Najib and his wife, Rosmah Mansor, they are barred from leaving the country. The new government immediately comes in and sets up a special task force headed by former Attorney General Tan Sri Abdul Ghani Patel. Remember, the guy who had previously lost his job. He is now going to be renewing investigations into the 1MDB scandal, and almost immediately, the police start seizing everything. Cash, valuable items, all these varying things that amount to anywhere between $220 and $270 million from residential units that were linked to Najib and his wife, Rosmah Mansor. As claimed by the police, this was the biggest seizure in Malaysian history, with the seized items comprising of more than 12,000 pieces of jewelry, 423 valuable watches, and 567 handbags made up of 37 different luxury brands. I genuinely, for the life of me, could not even possibly hope to understand why someone would need that many handbags. I don't get it. And neither does the new government of Malaysia, then, because Najib is subsequently then arrested by the MACC. By September of 2018, he was going to face 25 charges relating to abuse of power and money laundering, amounting to $556 million, on top of 7 different charges with criminal breach of trust and power abuse that were brought against him in the preceding 2 months. So, what happens? Well, we're going to move through this rather quick, but in 2019 to 2020, Najib goes on trial, and all the nasty details of the previous years are revealed. As an example of just one of the cover-ups that we're talking about here, on January 8th, 2020, the MACC would release 9 phone audio recordings that were recorded between the 5th of January to the 29th of July back in 2016, with about 45 minutes worth of recording. This would reveal multiple attempts by Najib to cover up investigations into the 1MDB scandal. As an example of one of these, separate recordings would capture conversations between Najib and parties from the United Arab Emirates, including the UAE Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan and Mubdala Development Company Managing Director Khaldun Al Mubarak. The calls were made following the U.S. Department of Justice announcement back in July of 2016 that billions of dollars had been stolen from 1MDB. He would say, and I quote in this call, "We are experiencing a bit of dark clouds as a result of yesterday's announcement by the DOJ." This being a statement he would say to the Crown Prince. Najib would also be heard asking for a personal request for the UAE to establish a loan agreement between his stepson, Riza Aziz, and the UAE Deputy Prime Minister, Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, due to the fact that there was a 1MDB money trail to Riza's Hollywood film production house, Red Granite Pictures. He would say, and I quote, "The problem is relatively small. If there can be an agreement with Sheikh Mansour, a loan agreement that will show it is a legitimate financing package, not money laundering. He is under pressure in America, and I am worried about him being a scapegoat. I would appreciate if that agreement can be signed quickly so it appears as a legitimate loan. When he received it, the bank cleared the source of money, so he was not aware." For anyone who didn't process what it was that I was saying here from these different audio statements, he was essentially trying to get this guy within the United Arab Emirates, right? He was trying to get him to agree to make a loan or create a record for a loan that would show the money that had been received by his stepson was legit. So falsify financial records. Yeah, that wasn't gonna fly. Ultimately, this cover-up would never be able to come into fruition, and so in July of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, Najib Razak was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years of jail time and fined $49.5 million. For the 3 criminal breaches of trust, as well as also the 3 counts of money laundering, he was ordered to serve 10 years of jail for each. The one reprieve that he was going to get from this is that all of the sentences were set to run concurrently, meaning that Najib, despite all of the varying 10-year sentences, was not going to be sentenced for 70 years or anything like that. Instead, he would only serve a total of 12 years in jail, which, considering everything, is extremely lenient. But wait, It gets worse. Respectively, on the 8th of December 2021 and the 23rd of August 2022, the Court of Appeal and the federal court would uphold the conviction and sentence of Najib. He wasn't going to get away with it. You may wonder why that is worse. We're not quite there yet. On the 1st of September 2022, Najib's wife, Rosmah Mansor, would also be found guilty of 3 counts of corruption by the Malaysian High Court and was sentenced to both a 10-year jail term of imprisonment and also a $300 million fine. So again, where's the bad part? This is supposed to be it, right? It's over. The case is closed. They caught him. Well, no. You see, the thing is, my friends, billions of dollars were still missing. Major figures like Joe Low and others were still at large, with who knows how much funds still on them. Not to mention how many other possible government figures are wrapped up in the case as well, that I simply do not have the entire day that would be required to explain that, as the whole thing is still an ongoing case. But arguably, worse than any of that is that justice may not actually be as final as many of you hope after listening to this story. You see, my friends, the authorities in Malaysia went and halved the sentence of Najib Razak in February of 2024 this year, in a move that has triggered a lot of outrage within the country. The leniency for Mr. Najib comes after weeks of speculation in Malaysia that he might end up actually being pardoned by King Sultan Abdullah, whose tenure under Malaysia's unique rotational monarchy system would end at that time. But many analysts would say that it was unlikely that Mr. Najib, who at the time had only served 17 months of his term, would receive any form of clemency because he was still facing 3 continuing criminal cases related to the 1MDB scandal. But then, 3 or 4 months ago, Malaysia's pardon board would say that Mr. Najib, who began his 12-year sentence in 2022, would instead be released in August of 2028, after 6 years. And his $50 million fine was going to be reduced down to $11 million. Mind you, he seemingly stole almost $1 billion himself, and it was only going to cost him now $11 million. Even worse than that, according to Malaysian law, he could even be released from his sentence earlier. In August of 2026, if he applies for parole after serving half of his term, this might just be granted. That means 3 years. As one could probably imagine, this announcement would spur a wave of anger across the country, as Malaysians would say that this was doing nothing more than cementing the culture within Malaysia in which politicians, the top elites of the country, could pretty much do whatever it is that they wanted. Much of the money that disappeared from the 1MDB fund has not been recovered. In September of 2023, a court would suddenly end up dismissing 47 different embezzlement charges that were filed against Ahmad Zahid Hamidi, who was the deputy prime minister. More and more people, as time go on, are seemingly having their charges and relations to the case swept under the rug. The entire thing, the decision, is likely to reignite questions about the rule of law in Malaysia, and likely this is going to increase the frustration of the public and their disillusionment with the current Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, a guy who, when he first entered into office, ran on a platform of anti-corruption, but people are saying that he has made now too many compromises. Arguably, the most scary part about all of this is that despite Mr. Najib's conviction, he is still actually really influential within UMNO, whose members now make up part of Mr. Anwar's government. The party still retains considerable support among ethnic Malays, people who benefited during Mr. Najib's 9-year rule and whom Mr. Anwar is now trying to court political favor. The United Malays National Organization has long said that the case against Mr. Najib was not real, that it was politically motivated, and his supporters have always expressed hope that he was going to get out of prison and come back and revive his political career. Despite every single thing that we have gone over here today, that may unfortunately, in the next couple years, become the new political reality. Really now, only time will tell. But that, my friends, is the end of today's story, and the end, for now, of the 1MDB scandal. Though, to be fair, this is something that is still ongoing. My friends, this has been Altantuya with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. I ask that you like, comment, and subscribe, and please let me know in the comment section below what other things you would like to do next. There are a couple things that I have here coming up that I really want to do. I am thinking that we're going to cover the whole mess that is Egypt's new capital that they are trying to build in the desert. I also want to talk about the North Korea of Central Asia, Turkmenistan, and if there's any other ideas, any other geopolitical issues or other things that you all want to know the background on, or really a deep dive into, then by all means, let me know in the comments section below, as the amount of times that we can cover corruption cases, dictators, or anything else that exists in today's day and age, it's kind of disheartening to say the least. My friends, thank you all for watching. I will see you all next time, and goodbye.